Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi shir.
Shalom and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Brachos Daf Chav Zayin. We're on Chavav Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad arba shois. One may daven shachris up until 4 hours. Now the question is, when Rabbi Yehuda uses the word ad, until, does he mean up until but not including the 4th hour? Or does he mean ad up until the fourth hour, including? Is ad inclusive or not? Now when the Rabbanan say that one daven shachris up until Chatzois, it certainly doesn't mean including Chatzois. One can't daven past midday. However, according to Rabbi Yehuda, when he says ad arba shois, does he mean including the 4th hour? Ad is inclusive. He can daven even within the 4th hour. Or does it mean up until but not including? It says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad arba shois. The Gemara had a question. Ad v'ad b'chlal. When he says ad until, does he mean inclusive? Oidilma ad v'lay ad b'chlal, not inclusive. Tashma, listen to this raya. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad plag ha-mincha. Regarding mincha, Rabbi Yehuda holds one may daven only until plag ha-mincha, halfway point of mincha. We're speaking about mincha ketana, the lesser mincha, meaning from 9.5 hours up until midnight, up until nightfall. So that's a total of 2.5 hours. Rabbi Yehuda holds the time of mincha is up until the halfway into this mincha ketana, meaning take the 2.5 hour period, split it into 2. So one may daven up until an hour and a quarter past 9.5. That's 10 and 3/4 hours. So Rita says ad up until plaga mincha. Now when he says the word ad there, what does he mean? Does he mean inclusive or not inclusive? Says the Gemara again, Tashma. Well, let's listen to this proof from our Mishnah. Rida Eimad Plaga Mincha, Ridav Mincha up until Plaga Mincha. Iyamas B'Shlema, if you would say, it all works out if Ad V'lo Ad B'Chlal. If Ad is not inclusive. Why? Because in that case, there's a machlekes between the Rabbanan who say one may daven up until nightfall, and Rabbi Yehuda says, no, up until Plaga Mincha, meaning up until the second half of Mincha, meaning up until 10 and 3/4 hours. Why? Because Ad Plaga Mincha means up until the halfway point, but not inclusive, not including that second half of Mincha. So we have a machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda who holds Mincha is up until, Tfilas HaMincha is up until 10 and 3/4 hours, and the Rabbanan say up until nightfall. Hainu d'ika ben Rabbi Yehuda Rabbanan. So we have a machlekes between the shittas of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan. Eloi amres ad vad b'chlal. But if you suggest that ad means inclusive, Rav Yehuda hainu Rabbanan. If so, when Rav Yehuda says you daven up until ad plaga mincha, what he's really meaning to say is up until nightfall, because ad means including the second half of mincha ketana, meaning including the last hour and a quarter of mincha ketana, basically means until nightfall. So it's the same as Rabbanan. It's an identical sheet as Rabbanan. So what's machlekes? So you can't say, evidently according to Rabbi Yehuda, we can't say that ad is inclusive. Says the Gemara on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, Elamai. So you must say ad v'lo ad b'chlal. Okay, when Rabbi Yehuda uses the word ad, he means not inclusive. If so, it makes sense that plaga mincha, ad plaga mincha means up until, but not including the second half of mincha, meaning up until 10 and 3/4. Whereas Rabbanan hold you may daven up until nightfall. So we have a machlekes. Similarly, regarding the halacha of shachris, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can daven up until the 4th hour, not including the 4th hour. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, let's take a look at the latter part of the Mishnah. Regarding Musaf, V'shal Musaf and Kol Hayom. The Rabbanan hold Musaf can be daven the entire day. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ad sheva shoyos, only up until 7 hours, ad sheva shoyos. Now, if we say that ad is v'lo ad b'chlal, so Musaf, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is only up until the beginning of the 7th hour, meaning up until Chatzois midday, not including the 7th hour. Okay, but how's that going to work with the following brisa? V'tani, we learned the brisa as follows. If one is faced with 2 tefillos, he needs to daven 2 separate prayers. Acha shel Musaf, acha shel Mincha. He has not yet daven Musaf, nor has he daven Mincha. So he has a choice of 2. Which one should go first? Which one takes priority? Says the brisa, Mispalel shel Mincha. First he davens Mincha, va'acha kach shel Musaf, and following that he davens Musaf. Why? Shezu tedira v'zu eina tedira. We know there's halacha that tadir, when something comes frequently with the she'eina tadir, and something that is not as frequent, tadir kaitim, the one that is more frequent, takes priority. So here too, says the Brisa, since what is more tadir, what is more commonly prayed, it is mincha. So mincha takes priority over musaf when he's faced with a choice of davening mincha or musaf. Mincha takes priority. First he davens mincha, followed by musaf. So we follow the rule of tadir kaidim. This is the shita of the Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, no, mispal shel musaf, v'achar shel mincha. First comes musaf, and only following that mincha. Why? Says Rabbi Yehuda, there's an additional factor here. Aside from the tadir factor, there's another consideration. Shezu iveres, because one of them is something that which will pass us, something which he may lose. V'zu ein iveres, and the other one is not iveres, is not terminating it. Meaning that since the tfilas musaf, the time, the deadline to daven musaf is fast approaching, that's considered to be a tefillah, a veres, a passing mitzvah. So, in order not to lose the opportunity to daven musaf, he must precede, he must prioritize and daven musaf first. Since the zman of musaf is fast approaching, the deadline is fast approaching, that's called a mitzvah, a veres, a mitzvah which is passing. So therefore that takes priority over mincha. Why? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, musaf, the time frame for musaf is limited. According to Rabbanan, one can daven musaf and mincha the entire day. So there's no averis factor, there's no passing factor, none of them are mitzvah averis. They both have the same identical time frame. They both could be daven the entire day. Therefore, we revert to the rule, to the klal, to the general halacha of tadir kodim. That is the Rabbanan. However, according to Rabbi Yehuda, since Rabbi Yehuda maintains that musaf can only be daven up until 7 hours, so musaf is considered to be a mitzvah averis, a passing mitzvah with a limited time frame. And therefore he prioritizes and he davens musaf first, and only then mincha. Says the Gemara, let's prove from here regarding our original question. Says the Gemara, if you will maintain that ad v'ad b'chlal, that when Rabbi Yehuda uses the word ad until, when he says, for instance, that musaf is ad sheva shoyes, until 7 hours. What does he mean by that? He means including the 7th hour, you may daven musaf up until 1 o'clock. If that's the case, then this brisa works. So we have a time frame where a person can be faced with the choice of needing to daven musaf or mincha. Which time frame is that? That's from 6.5 hours up until 7. Because let's remember, mincha can only be davened from 6.5 and on. That is the time of mincha gedayla, as we mentioned yesterday. Musaf can only be davened up until 1 o'clock, up until the end of the 7th hour. The 7th hour begins at midday, so there is a time frame. There is that half-hour space where a person can have a choice between mincha and musaf. Says the Gemara again, it's all good and well if you would say ad v'ad b'chlal. When Rabbi Yehuda uses the word ad, he means to include. So ad sheva shoyes, which is stated regarding musaf, means including the 7th hour until 1 o'clock. Therefore, you can find mishkachas, it is to be found two tefillas b'hadei adadi, two tefillas that their times coincide, that they overlap with each other. Eloi amers, but if you maintain the ad v'loi ad b'chlal, then when Rabbi Yehuda uses the word ad, he means not including. If so, it won't work. You can never find that the musaf and the mincha will overlap. Why? Given the ashla shel mincha, once the time for mincha approaches, which is 6.5 hours into the day, the time for musaf has already expired. Since musaf can only be davened up until the 7th hour, meaning up until the beginning of the 7th hour, up until midday and no more, so musaf can only be davened up until midday. Mincha only picks up a half hour later. So there's never a time frame where these two tefillas will overlap. So the brisa won't work. Ella, says the Gemara, you must say, Elamai, ad v'ad b'chlal. Okay, let's revert to that. We must say, inevitably, that when Yudas uses the word ad, he means inclusive. So kashi reisha. Then the beginning will be difficult. Ma'ika ben Yavidu Rabbanan. Since regarding plag ha-mincha, this interpretation can't work out. Why? Once again, because if ad means ad v'ad b'chlal, inclusive, so when the Rabbanan say that mincha can be davened until nightfall, and Rabbi Yehuda says that it could only be davened until plag ha-mincha, which means up until the second half of mincha ketana. The second half of mincha ketana is an hour and a quarter past the beginning of Mincha Ketana begins at 9:30. An hour and a quarter later, 10 3/4, that is Ad Plaga Mincha. Now, if Ad means inclusive, so that includes that second half, meaning up until nightfall. So we have no difference of opinion between Rav Yehuda and Rabbanan. So we're back stuck with our original question. Says the Gemara, no. You misinterpreted the words. Says the Gemara, Bisavris, the high Plag Mincha. When Rav Yehuda says you could daven Mincha until Plaga Mincha, which half was he speaking about? You figured he was speaking about the second half of Mincha. And therefore you said, well, if Ad is inclusive, including the second half is nightfall. The Gemara says, no. Plag, you thought that Plag Mincha is Plag Achroina Kama, the second half of Mincha Ketana. It is not so. It is Plag Rishoina Ka'amar. When Rav Yehuda says Ad Plag Mincha, means until the first half of Mincha Ketana. Therefore, when he says Ad, meaning until and including Plag Mincha, the half of Mincha, he meant including the first half of Mincha Ketana, meaning from 9:30 up until 10 3/4 and no more. So we have a machlekes, a clear machlekes between Rav Yehuda that allows Mincha up until 10 3/4 and the Rabbanan that allow up until nightfall. Now we had a brisa which said that according to Rav Yehuda Omer Plaga Mincha is Yud Aleph Shois Chaser Revia. We had a brisa that seemed to say that when Rav Yehuda says up until Plaga Mincha, he meant up until 10 3/4. So we took that to mean, in yesterday's daf, that Rav Yehuda means to say that up until Plaga Mincha means the second half of Mincha. That's why the Brisa used the words up until 11 hours minus a quarter, meaning 10 3/4, because he was referring to the second half of Mincha, which begins at 10 3/4. Says the Gemara, we need to interpret it a bit differently. This is what the Brisa means to say. Emas Nafik, Plag Rishoina. What is the point where the first half leaves, Va'ayel Plag Achroina, and the second half of Mincha comes in? That is at the point of Mechinafki Yud Al Shois Chaser Revia. That is at the point of 11 minus a quarter. Meaning, what is the midpoint of Mincha Ketana? What is the midpoint? What is Plaga Mincha? When does the first half leave and the second one come in? That is the point of 10 3/4 hours. But the Brisa wasn't referring to, didn't mean to say that when Rav Yehuda says Ad Plaga Mincha, he means the point of 10 3/4 hours. Plaga Mincha is referring to the first half of Mincha. The first half of Mincha, which begins at 9:30. And when Rav Yehuda says up until Plaga Mincha, what may daven Mincha, he meant to say he can daven up until and including the first half of Mincha Ketana, meaning up until 10 3/4, and that is different than the Shittas Chacham that allow Mincha up until nightfall. Okay, so the conclusion is that according to Rav Yehuda, when Rav Yehuda used the word Ad, until he meant inclusive. Whether it's regarding Shachris, up until Ad Arba Shois, he may daven up until 4 hours, meaning including the fourth hour. When Rav Yehuda says Ad Plaga Mincha, what he meant to say, up until and including the first half of Mincha Ketana. When Rav Yehuda says Musaf may daven Ad Sheva Shois, what he meant was up until and including the 7th hour, up until 1 o'clock. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman, Afanana mitanina. We also have a brisa which supports this interpretation of Rav Yehuda that Ad is inclusive. Says the brisa as follows: Rav Yehuda ben Bava Heyid Chamish Dvarim. He testified on the coming 5 halachas. Number 1, Shememan and Saktana. We encourage a Ktana, a minor, to reject her husband. Rashi explains it's referring to the halacha of a Ktana who has a Nesun D'Rabbanan. We know that only an adult can be married midaraisa. However, the Rabbanan said that even a Ktana who Minatar, only if she has a father, if the father can hand her over for Kedushin, can marry her off. However, if she has no father, if she's an orphan, then her relative, say her mother, can marry her off, but it is only a Kedushin D'Rabbanan. Now, what will be in the case where one marries a Ktana with a Kedushin, with a D'Rabbanan marriage, a rabbinic marriage, and it turns out that his brother married her sister, who was a Gdoila, which makes it a biblical marriage, and he's suing D'Oraisa. Now his brother dies childless. His wife is a Yavama. She falls to Yivam. This brother, the surviving brother, has a mitzvah of Yivam to be Miyabim, this woman. Now the problem here is that when a Yavama is an Ereva, is a close relative of one's wife, she's exempt from Yivam. However, in this case, we have a problem. Since his wife is only a minor Ktana, who only has a Nisun D'Rabbanan. In this case, we're stuck. We have a dilemma. Because on the one hand, he cannot be Miyabim, the Yivama, because she's a sister of his wife, who is his wife Midrabanan. She's a Chais Ishta Midrabanan. At the same time, he can't remain married to his wife, since she is a Chais Zekuka, she's a sister of a Yivama, who is legally bound to him for Yivam. It's like a quasi-wife. So, he can't remain with her either because she's like a Chais Ishta. She's considered like the sister of his wife because the Yivama is bound to him. She's a quasi Isha. So we're stuck. What do we do? So the Gemara said there's a shita that says that we encourage this minor, this Tana, to be in mind, to reject her husband. The halacha is if a Tana walks off on her husband, she rejects her husband, there are halachas in it. It needs to be done in front of Dayanim, etc. So if she rejects her husband, then we consider the marriage to be null and void retroactively. So the Gemara says that Rav Yehuda Bava testified that the proper way to handle this dilemma is that the Ketana should reject her husband, she should walk off on him, and this way her marriage is null and void, and it is as though they never married. And now he can go be Miyabim, the Yavama. She's not considered to be Achos Ishtoi. It was as though he never married the Ketana. And this way he can be Miyabim and do the mitzvah of Yibum. So that was the first halacha which he taught. The second halacha was Ushemasin Seisha al Pi Echad. If one's husband had traveled away and there came news through one witness who comes to testify that her husband is alive no more, we allow it to remarry, although ordinarily 2 Eidim are required for such a thing. Nevertheless, the Chacham were lenient in this matter, as explained in the Gemara Yivamis. So this too was one of his halachas. Shemasi and Asishta, we allow a woman to remarry al Pi Dechad, according to the testimony of one witness. Number 3 was Val Tarnagel Sheniskal B'Shalayim. They stoned a rooster al Shaharis and Nefesh since he killed somebody. And the lesson here is that not only a ox who kills gets stoned, but any type of animal, even a rooster. Number 4 was Val Yayim Ben Abraham Yoim. Fresh wine, merely 40 days old, can be used as a carbon, as a nisacham on the mizbeach. Since it's 40 days old, it's not considered to be fresh wine anymore. It has a status of proper wine, of aged wine. And finally, Val Tamid Shel Shachar. This is the one that's pertaining to our sugya. Val Tamid Shel Shachar Shekarev Arvashois. That the morning Tamid was hukrav in the 4th hour. So we see that even in the 4th hour, they were able to mark the carbon tamid, and this fits with the interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda that Ad Arbashois includes the 4th hour, since let's recall the tefillos, these many tefillos, the times designated for tefillos, corresponded to these times of the karbanos. Why does Rabbi Yehuda state that the Zman of Shachar is up until 4 hours? That is because the tamid was hukrav at that time. So we see here that the Talmud was brought within the 4th hour as well. Evidently, Ad Arba Shois until 4 hours means including the 4th hour. Shema Mina, we have a raya from here. That Ad, V'Ad B'chlal, it's inclusive. Shema Mina, indeed, this is a proof. Or Rav Kana. Halacha Rav Yehuda. The halacha follows Rav Yehuda's shita that one may daven up until the 4th hour. The Karban Talmud was brought up until then. Why? Why do we follow Rav Yehuda's shita? Hoyel since utnan b'vchirasa kavasei. Because in the Mishnahs of Idiyos, the Masechet Idiyos, which is the choicest, those halachas were authoritative, they were accepted as halacha, and therefore since this halacha is mentioned in that Masechta in Idiyos, this was the Mishnah that we just mentioned, since in that Masechta, which is the choicest of halachas, is mentioned, is included, this sheet of Yehuda, apparently that is what the halacha follows. Continues the Gemara. Who is the author of the following Mishnah? We know that the man in the Midbar was meant to be collected, as the Pasuk says, they collected it in the morning, and when the sun heated up, it would melt. The Chazal say it created streams, and it would flow, and the animals would drink from it, and even the Goyim, the non-Jews, their animals would benefit from it, and their flesh would have the taste of the man. So the sun would come out and melt the man. Says the Brisa, the sun would come out, warm it up, and melt it. Ba'arba shois, this took place in the 4th hour. This is already past the picking time. They picked the man up until then, and then in the 4th hour it melted. To Omer, you say ba'arba shois. This is regarding the 4th hour. Perhaps, what does the pasuk mean when the sun melted the man? Perhaps that took place b'shei shois, after midday. So that can't be. When the pasuk elsewhere says k'choim hayom, uses the term k'choim hayom, with the day heated up, in the heat of day, that implies that the entire world was heated up. Harishei shois amar, that's referring to midday when everything is hot. However, when the pasuk here says merely when the pasuk here says that when the sun heated up, when one was in the sunlight, it was hot, and that's when it melted the man. So it's a little bit of a different term. Only in the sunlight, when one is directly exposed to the sun, he is warm. That is apparently a earlier time than K'choim Hayom, which denotes that the entire world heated up. So apparently this is earlier, and this is merely Ba'arba shois, it's the 4th hour. So we have two terms. We have K'choim Hayom, within the heat of day, that denotes a greater level of heat, that is already midday. When only one who is exposed to the sun, he receives warmth, that is an earlier time period. Only when you're in the sunlight, then you're hot. But in the shade, it is still cool, that is an earlier time period, that is the 4th hour. So when the pasuk discusses this is already after Baboiker, because Baboiker, the morning, was when they picked the man. After that came the period of V'chama shemesh v'namis, when the sun heated things up and the man melted. So that is the 4th hour, which is already past the picking time. It is past Baboiker. So who's the author of this Mishnah? That implies that the 4th hour is already not Baker. It's already past the time that they picked the man. They picked the man by Baker, then comes V'chama shemesh, the sun heats things up in the 4th hour. Who's the author? Mani, loy Rabbi Yehuda v'lei Rabbanan. It can't be following neither Rabbi Yehuda nor Rabbanan. Why? If it's following Rabbi Yehuda's shita, Ada Arba Shois na mitzafrahu. We just concluded that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the 4th hour as well is considered to be tzafra, considered to be morning. So that was still the time when they picked the man. It can't be that the V'chama shemesh v'namis was the 4th hour. That was still, the 4th hour was still a Baker. If we're following the view of the Rabbanan, at chatzos na mitzafrahu. How can you say that the 4th hour is already past picking time? It was already V'chama shemesh v'namis. No, according to Rabbanan, Baker continues up until chatzos, up until midday. Why? Because according to Rabbanan, one may daven shachar up until chatzos, because that is the time for Tamid Shel Shachar. Now we know Tamid Shel Shachar was connected with Baker. About Baker. So apparently Baker, the time frame of Baker continues up until chatzos. So certainly this Mishnah, which says that Baker finished, was done already, done and over with by the time the 4th hour came along, can't be following Shit's Rabbanan. So we're stuck. Says the Gemara, Iba is saying Rav Yehuda, if you'll say it can be Rav Yehuda. Iba is saying if you prefer, Rabbanan can follow Shit's Rabbanan. How is that? Iba is saying Rabbanan. If you prefer, this Mishnah can follow the Shit's Rabbanan. Why? Because although Baker means morning, and morning means up until Chatzos, by the man, the Torah uses a little bit different lashon. Uses a double Baboiker. Vayilku to Oisei Baboiker. This implies that we take the Baker time frame, meaning from the beginning of the day until Chatzos, and we split into two sections, Baboiker and Baboiker. And the time for picking the man only happened in the first Baboiker. For the first 3 hours. Past 3 hours was already past picking time. Let's see inside. Take the morning period, the 6 hour period, and split into two. And the man was only meant to be picked on the first part, Baboiker, the earliest part of Baker. Once it's past 3 hours, it was already, the deadline for picking the man was over. And out came the sun, and warmed things up and melted the man. So this could be going according to Shit's Rabbanan, or if you prefer, Rabbi Yehuda, hi Baker, Yisera. When the pasuk says Baboiker, it's an extra Baker, lahaktim leishachas, to bump it up an hour, to move it up an hour. Although Baboiker means including the 4th hour, but Baboiker means an hour earlier up until the 4th hour. So the Brachos, this Mishnah of the man describing that the man was only picked for the first 3 hours, past that was V'chama shemesh v'namis, can be going either according to Rabbanan or according to Yehuda, since the pasuk uses a double lashon Baboiker to denote that the picking of the man ended earlier than what is usually considered to be Boker. Says the Gemara in conclusion, the Kuli Alma, everybody holds Mia v'chama shemesh v'nomes ba'arba shois, that when the pasuk says the sun comes out and melts, it was referring to the 4th hour. My mashma, what do you see a hint to the 4th hour in those words? Amar v'achbar Yaakov, Amar kra v'chama shemesh v'nomes. The sun warms things up and melts. Eze shamash hashemesh chama tzertzoin. What is the time then that the sunlight, when one is in the sun, he is warm, but the shade is still cool. This is the 4th hour, because past that, once it gets to midday, the whole area, the whole world is already warmed up. There's no cool area. Even the shade is already warm. Continues the Gemara. Hasam, regarding the other halacha of Shachris, Amar Rav Kahana stated for us, halacha Rav Yehuda. We follow the opinion of Yehuda that one davens up until the 4th hour. Why? As we mentioned earlier, because in the choicest, meaning in the Maseches Edis, it is quoted. Hachamai. What about regarding Mincha? Who do we follow? What does the halacha conclude? According to who are we meant to daven? Ishtik, he remained silent. He didn't respond. Let's take a look. Midarav Matzli. We found that Rav would daven. Shal Shabbos ve'er Shabbos mi ba'oidyoim. We saw that Rav davened. The tefillah of Shabbos was still by day. It was still daylight. So obviously, Shema Mina Halach Rav Yehuda. Apparently, he follows the view of Rav Yehuda that Mincha is meant to be davened only up until Plaga Mincha, and past Plaga Mincha is already time for Ma'ariv. Therefore, he davened. He allowed himself to daven the tefillah of Arvis of Shabbos when it was still day. Apparently, he paskins like Rav Yehuda. Says more Adrab, just the opposite. Midrafun of Rabbanon, from the fact that we see that Rafun and Rabbanon lo have a matzah adurta. They would only daven Ma'ariv at night. Shema Mina, apparently they hold ein Halach Rav Yehuda. The halacha does not follow Rav Yehuda. We follow the Rabbanon that Arvis only begins after nightfall. Says the Gemara in conclusion, Hashta now, the Le'itmar, we haven't had something authoritative. So we don't have a conclusion regarding this halacha. Loi kamar, not like Rav Yehuda, not like Rabbanon. Therefore, how should one conduct himself to Avid Kamar Avid if one follows the Shita of Mar of this master, meaning what Rav Yehuda, or the Avid Kamar Avid, one who follows the other Shita Avid, he has done properly. So we say, there's no conclusion, and whichever way you go, you're okay. The Avid Kamar, if you follow this Shita, Avid, you've done properly. The Avid Kamar, you've done like this Shita, Avid, you've done properly. Now in Halakha it's brought down that, practically speaking, a person must make a choice for all time, meaning a person can't just follow one Shita one day and the other Shita the other day. A person must follow one Shita all throughout. And generally speaking, our custom is to follow the Shita's Rabbanon. We daven Mincha up until nightfall. In that case, we cannot be Magdim, we cannot daven Ma'ariv earlier, since we're following Shittas Rabbanon, Mincha until nightfall, and then begins Arvis. However, in a Shas Atchak, in a time of pressing need, a person can precede his Ma'ariv even during daytime past Plaga Mincha, provided that he hadn't contradicted himself on that day. Meaning, he ensured that his Mincha was davened prior to Plaga Mincha, according to the Shittas Rabbi Yehuda, then he may follow with Ma'ariv immediately following Plaga Mincha. But he can't use the same time frame for both tefillahs. That would be a self-contradiction. There is an allowance for a tzibur who are afraid of losing their members. If they disperse, they won't come back anymore. So there's allowance for a tzibur to daven Mincha Ma'ariv in the same time frame. And an individual who's present here was afraid, concerned about missing out his opportunity for tefillah with tzibur. He too is allowed to daven tzibur with them, provided that he himself doesn't self-contradict himself. He makes sure to daven his mincha prior to Plaga Mincha. So this is discussed in the Paiskim, and there's one exception regarding Erev Shabbos. Since we are Makabel Shabbos early, so that is not a problem. Since the Kedusha Shabbos comes early, it is considered to be Taisus Shabbos, adding onto the Shabbos, and in that case, we daven Ma'ariv earlier, without much hesitation, provided that once again we don't self-contradict ourselves and we make sure to daven Mincha prior to Plaga Mincha. Continues the Gemara. Rav Ikla Gniva. Rav came to the place of Gniva, V'tzoli Shal Shabbos V'Erev Shabbos, and he davened the Shabbos Tefillah when it was still Erev Shabbos, it was still day. Now, V'avamasli Rav Yirmiyah Ba'abba L'chayr. Rav Yirmiyah Ba'abba was davening Shemon Esrei behind him. L'chayr de Rav. You see him, Rav completed Shemon Esrei. V'lei paskel it's slices Rav Yirmiyah. He didn't walk past Rav Yirmiyah, meaning Rav Yirmiyah was behind Rav, and they were both davening, for instance, in front of a wall. So Rav needed to pass through, and he didn't interrupt. He didn't want to pass between Rav Yirmiyah and the wall to get to his place, but rather he waited around patiently until Rav Yirmiyah completed his davening. Says the Gemara, Shema Minah class. We learn from here, we derive 3 halachas. Shema Minah number 1, Mispal Adam Shal Shabbos Erev Shabbos. One may daven the Shabbos Tefillah on Erev Shabbos. Number 2, Shema Minah Mispalel Talmud Nachay Rabbi. A student could daven behind his Rebbe. That's not a problem. It's not a disrespect, or, as we'll see soon, another concern. So we see that's allowed. Shema Minah, we learn from here. Also, Lavar Connected Mispalel, one may not interrupt. Go in front of the Mispalel. One must go around one who's davening Shemona Esrei. Says the Gemara, Shimon Levi. This supports the halacha of Shimon Levi, who taught us the same halacha that Omer Shimon Levi, Osur La'avar Connected Mispalel. One may not pass in front of one who is davening Shemona Esrei. Eini, is that so? Says the Gemara, Rav Ami, Rav Asi, Chalfi. They did pass in front of one who davened. Says the Gemara, no, Rav Ami, Rav Asi, Chusla, Rav Amis, who the Chalfi. They passed outside of Dalad Amis. Dalad Amis, the 4 Amis, once again, is a domain, is considered to be the Makam Tefillah, and therefore one may not interrupt, one may not pass through, pass through this Makam Tefillah. He cannot pass through it. He's being mafsik between the person and the Shechina, but rather he must go around the domain, the Makam Tefillah, the Dalad Amis. So one may not trespass in between a person and the Shechina within the Dalad Amas of his tefillah, but must go around the Mispalel. Says the Gemara, again, Rav Ami, Rav Asi, Chusla ba'amis hu dechalfi. Says the Gemara, Rav Yirmiyah, hechi avadachi. How did Rav Yirmiyah daven behind his Rebbe? One may not do so. Va'amar Rav Yudam Rav, lo'olam ali spal adam, lo'i keneged rabbi. One cannot daven an equal footing to his Rebbe, meaning on the side. It looks like he's equating himself to his Rebbe. He's not respectful. And nor can he daven behind his Rebbe. Rashi says this is also considered to be haughtiness. Taisa says there's a concern that perhaps when he bows, it would appear as if he's bowing to his Rebbe, so one may not do so. In addition, says the Gemara, V'tani, we learned of Leza Omer, Hamaspala Chayir Rabbi, one who davens behind his Rebbe, or V'aneisin Shalom Rabbi, one who greets his Rebbe in the same manner as he greets an ordinary person. He says Shalom Alecha without saying Shalom Alecha Rebbe or Shalom Alecha Rebbe Moiri. That is not to be done. Or V'amachs Shalom Rabbi, he returns a greeting to his Rebbe in an ordinary fashion without dressing him appropriately. Or V'achilek al Shivasei Rabbi, one who challenges the academy, the yeshiva of his Rebbe. The Rambam explains this means that if somebody establishes a yeshiva without asking permission of his Rebbe, this is challenging his Rebbe's authority. Or Va'omer Davar Shalei Shamam Pi Rabbi, one who says over something that he hadn't heard from his Rebbe. Now people assume that if you're a Talmud of this Rebbe, so we assume that anything you're saying you're merely saying over what your Rebbe taught you. So if one goes ahead and says something over, and it is not something that he heard from his Rebbe, so people will erroneously attribute it to his Rebbe. So all these things are something not meant to be done, and he is Gorim l'shchina she'tistalch Yisrael. It causes the divine presence to leave Klal Yisrael. So in conclusion, we see that one is not meant to daven behind his Rebbe. So how was Rav Yirmiyah Ba'abba allowed to do so? Says the Gemara, Shani Rav Yirmiyah Ba'abba, that is different. The Talmud Chaveru, although he was a Talmud, but he was also a colleague. He was just as knowledgeable as Rav, and therefore davening behind him was not a concern. Says Gemara, we will support this suggestion that Rav Yirmiyah was a Talmud Chaver, he was a colleague. V'hainu, that's why the Kamali Rav Yirmiyah Ba'abba Rav. That's why when Rav Yirmiyah Ba'abba addressed Rav, he addressed him in the following manner. He said, Mi Batlas, did you refrain from doing malacha? Meaning, I see that you're davening the Shabbos Tefillah, you're already davening Shabbos Dik, it's still Friday, and you're already davening the Shabbos Tefillah. Have you refrained from doing malacha? Are you being Mekabel Shabbos completely? And he said, Amar Le'in, yes I did. I was already Mekabel Shabbos, I accepted upon myself the complete Tush Shabbos, I refrained from the work, from the malachas that are prohibited on Shabbos. In Badilna, yes, I have separated. Amar mi Badilmar, what kind of terminology did he use when he addressed him? He said, mi Badlas, did you separate yourself? He didn't address him with the title Mi Badal Mar. Did the master separate? So you see that he didn't use these type of terms because he was his Talmud Chaver, because he was a colleague, and those terms were not required. So we see that he wasn't a ordinary Talmud, but rather a colleague, and therefore he was allowed to daven behind him. Continues the Gemara. Umi badil, was he badil? Is that so that he separated himself from doing malacha when he davened early? Va'amar Rabbi Abin said the following thing. Pam achas ispal Rebbe shel Shabbos be'erev Shabbos. One time, Rebbe davened the Shabbos tefillah on erev Shabbos. He davened the Shabbos a good tefillah while it was still day. V'nichnas l'merchatz. And then afterwards he went into the bathhouse. V'yotzi came out v'shalom pirkin and he taught us the shir. V'adayin l'cheshecha still prior to darkness. Darkness hadn't arrived yet. So we see from here that even when one wishes to daven the Shabbos tefillah early, he's not required to refrain from malacha. It is not a contradiction. So why did the Gemara say before that, since Rav davened early, he needed to refrain from doing malacha? It's a package deal. If you daven early, that means it's completely Shabbos and he can't do malacha. We have an incident with Rebbe, where he davened early. He already davened the Shabbos tefillah. Nevertheless, he didn't refrain from doing malacha. He went into the Beis HaMerchatz. Says the Gemara, Amarava, Hu nichas la'ziyah. He only went to steam himself, to sweat, a steam bath. So that wasn't really considered to be bathing himself, and that was allowed even on Shabbos. So although he was Makabel Kedusha Shabbos, that wasn't a problem. This was prior to the enactment of the decree of the Gzeira, the Chacham who prohibited this type of haziyah, of sweating, of the steam bath. This was prior to the Gzeira of the Rabbanon, therefore he was allowed to do it, even though it was Shabbos. Later on, the Chachamim made a Gzeira to prohibit one from being Maziyah on Shabbos. But here it was prior to the enactment of this Gzeira, therefore he was allowed to do so, even though he davened early, and he was Makabel on himself, Kedusha Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Eini, is that so? That if one davens early, he must assume the Kedusha Shabbos in its entirety and refrain from malachos. V'Abaye sharli Rav Dimi bar Levoy. Abaye allowed Rav Dimi bar Levoy l'chavruya sali to smoke up with the sulfur. They used to have some type of process where they smoked. They used smoke from sulfur to smoke their baskets. So this was a malacha, and he allowed him to do it even after he davened tefillah of Shabbos. So we see that it is not required to refrain from malacha. Says it was discussing a case where he made a mistake, he erred, he thought it was already Shabbos, he thought it was very dark, perhaps it was cloudy and it looked dark, so he davened and he thought it was Shabbos, but then it turned out it wasn't really dark yet, and therefore Abai allowed him to do malacha. Says the Gemara, midhadra, if one accepts Shabbos by mistake, unintentionally, he thinks it's already Shabbos, he was Makabel Shabbos, and he realized that he made an error, does that Kabbalah become nullified? Va'amar Avidan, didn't Avidan state the following story? Pamachas, there was once a story in the Skashu Shemaim Ba'avim, it got cloudy and it got dark, the public thought that it was Chashecha, was already dark, they thought it was Shabbos, they thought it was Matzah Shabbos, it was on Shabbos afternoon, they thought it was already Matzah Shabbos. They davened the weekday tefillah, Matzah Shabbos, but it was really B'Shabbos. So they davened Matzah Shabbos B'Shabbos, it was really on Shabbos. And the clouds dispersed, and the sun is showing through, and they realized that it was still Shabbos. So the question is there tefillah, is there Matzah Shabbos Ma'ariv valid or not? They asked him a question, what should they do about their Ma'ariv? Once they davened already, even though it was betos, it was erroneous, nevertheless, once they davened, and therefore it is valid. So we see here that something which happened erroneously is valid. So here too, regarding one who was Makabel Shabbos erroneously, it is valid. So how could the Gemara say that Abai allowed him to do a malacha since it was a tos, it was an error? We see that an error holds. Says the Gemara, Shanei Tzibur, a tzibur congregation is different. We don't require him to burden themselves to daven again. So this was a leniency regarding the tefillah of a tzibur. But certainly regarding a question of malacha, this concept wouldn't apply. Meaning something that happened erroneous doesn't hold any water, doesn't stand. Therefore, when one was Makabel Shabbos, betoz by mistake, he thought it was dark or it's Shabbos, he would accept on himself Shabbos. In that case, when it's verified that it's still Erev Shabbos, he can still do malacha. It's only regarding the tzibur at daven that we don't require him to daven again. Continues the Gemara. Omer Rav Chia bar Avin, Rav Tzoli shel Shabbos ve'er Shabbos. He davened the Shabbos tefillah and Erev Shabbos. Rav Yoshi Masli shel Motzei Shabbos v'Shabbos. This is a chiddush that even the Motzei Shabbos tefillah, the Ma'ariv of Motzei Shabbos, the weekday tefillah, one may daven that on Shabbos. Teres explains this is only when it's a pressing need of a dvar mitzvah and is a special circumstance that he needs to do so, and then he's allowed to do so. Otherwise, one is not meant to daven the weekday Shabbos, the weekday Ma'ariv of Motzei Shabbos when it's still daylight, when it's still Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Rav Tzoli shel Shabbos ve'erev Shabbos. He davened the Shabbos tefillah on Erev Shabbos. The question is, however, Omer Kiddush ala Kois, can he recite Kiddush on a cup of wine? Or not? It's still daylight, still broad daylight. Perhaps regarding tefillah, which is the Rabbanan, we allow him to do it, but regarding Kiddush, which is a mitzvah d'oraisa, perhaps he has to wait until nightfall. Says the Gemara, Tashma, come and listen, the Omer Nachman Shmuel. Yes, mispal adam shal Shabbos ve'erev Shabbos v'omer Kiddush ala Kois. He can make Kiddush even when it's still light. V'ilchos say, and Allah follows according to the Shita, and indeed that's our practice today, especially in the summertime. We have Makabel Shabbos early, and we make Kiddush even when it's still broad daylight. Because when Makabel Shabbos early, has the halachas of Shabbos, it is Tesefes Shabbos. Continues the Gemara, Rav Yoshi Matzli shel Motzei Shabbos b'Shabbos. Regarding the second halacha, that Rav Yoshi allows one to daven the weekday tefillah of Motzei Shabbos when it's still light, when it's still Shabbos. What about Havdalah? Omer Havdalah al Kois? Omer Havdalah al Kois? Can a person make Havdalah so early when it's still Shabbos, or not? Certainly regarding Malacha, he has to wait until nightfall. The question is regarding the act of Havdalah. So the Gemara, Tashma, the Omer Avidah Mashmol, Mispal Odam shel Motzei Shabbos v'Shabbos v'Omer Havdalah al Kois. He can do so when he davens Ma'ariv early, if he needs to, if it's a pressing need, the Shas Adchak, a Dvar Mitzvah is awaiting him, then he can do so. He can daven early and make Havdalah early, but certainly, again, regarding Malacha, he has to wait until nightfall. Omer Rav Zera, Omer Rav Asi, Omer Rav Lezer, Omer Chanina, Omer Rav. B'tzad Amud on the side of this pillar, occurred the following incident. His spalal, Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yosi, shel Shabbos ve'erev Shabbos. He davened the Shabbos davening early on Shabbos itself. Ke'as Ula, he said, the details are a bit different. Amar, B'tzad Smara Hava, it was on the side of a date tree, a palm tree. V'loi B'tzad Amadav, it wasn't the side of a pillar. It wasn't V'loi Rishmal Rabbi Yosi Hava, it wasn't Rishmal Rabbi Yosi, but rather it was regarding a different Mandama El Rabbi Lezer Rabbi Hava. V'loi Shel Shabbos ve'erev Shabbos Hava, it wasn't the Shabbos tefillah davened on Erev Shabbos, but rather it was Elo Shel Motzei Shabbos v'Shabbos Hava, it was the Motzei Shabbos tefillah, the weekday tefillah of Motzei Shabbos, which was davened on Shabbos. We need to be exact and precise in our relating of the event, since it has a practical halachic ramification. Continues the Gemara. Tefillah se'erev ein l'kva. The evening tefillah has no fixed time. One may daven the entire night. Says the Gemara, my ein l'kva. Why does the Mishnah use the word ein l'kva? It has no set. It has no set. It is not set. What does the Mishnah mean by using this type of words? If the Mishnah simply means to say that one may daven the entire night, listen, if so, why doesn't the Mishnah choose a different choice of words? Listen, tefillah se'erev kol halayla, can daven the entire night. What is the point of ein l'kva? It has no kviyos. It's not established. What does the Mishnah mean by that? Ela mai ein l'kva k'man omar tefillas arvis rishus. The Mishnah is teaching us a double lesson here. Number one, you can daven the entire night. Number two, it's not established. It is tefillas arvis rishus is an elective tefillah. It is not an obligatory tefillah. The Omar Avidah Mashmol tefillas arvis. What is the status of arvis? We have a machlekes. It is obligatory. It is a chayva. Rabbi Shua rishus. Amar Abaye halacha. The halacha follow k'divrei mechayva. It is obligatory. For Rabbi Amar halacha k'divrei rishus. It is merely a rishus. So that is the point and purpose of the Mishnah using this word tefillas ein l'kva. Number one, you can dive the entire night. Number two, it is not an established tefillah. It is not a bona fide tefillah. It is rishus. It is merely elective. Tais explains it doesn't mean to say that one can choose and decide whether or not he decides to daven Ma'ariv. Rishus merely means that it's not the same level as the other tefillahs. If he has a mitzvah, a passing mitzvah, he may forego the Ma'ariv on account of the passing mitzvah. So it's regarding certain circumstances. Continues the Gemara with a story regarding this halacha. A student came, he asked him the following question: Tefillas arvis rishus? Is it a rishus? Is it an elective tefillah? Chayva is an obligatory tefillah. Amar Lei, so Rishus responded, rishus. But the same student came to Gamliel and he asked him the same question. Amar Lei, tefillas arvis rishus? Chayva. Amar Lei to Gamliel, who was the nasi, said Amar Lei chayva. Amrle, so the student challenged him. Valay Rabbi Shua Amrle Rishus. Rabbi Shua had already told me that's Rishus. So why do you say that is Chayva? Amrle, so Rabbi Gamliel wasn't pleased with the ruling of Rabbi Shua, and he told him, Hamtin, wait around. Until the Bali Trace and the shield bearers, referring to the Talmud Chacham, who fight and debate each other in halacha. There's another explanation that Bali Trace means the shield bearers, since they protect the generation on account of their schusam and their merits of Liman HaTorah. So either way, he told them, wait until everybody fills the Beis Medrash. Shenichnasu Bali Trace, and when the crowd arrived, Amad Ashel, so the student got up and he asked this question. Tfilas Arvs Rishusay Chayva. Amalem Gamliel Chayva. Amalem Gamliel Chacham. So Gamliel now turned to the Chacham and he said, Klum Yesh Adam Chaylik V'Davar Zeh. Is there anybody that has an opposing view regarding Tfilas Arvs? Amalei Rabbi Shua laughs. Rabbi Shua says, no, nobody is disagreeing, everybody agrees with you. The Farshim say, he did it on account of the respect for Rabbi Gamliel, and also since Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi, on account of the public order, he didn't want to challenge his opinion in public. Amalei, so Rabbi Gamliel turned to Rabbi Shua and he said, V'alei Mishimcha Amruli Rishus. You were quoted as saying Rishus. So now Rabbi Shua was stuck. Amalei Rabbi Shua. Amalei, so Rabbi Gamliel told to Rabbi Shua, Yeshua, Amoy Daraglecha, get up on your feet, V'yidu B'cha, and they will testify against you. Amad Rishon Raglav, he got up on his feet, V'amar, and he said, if I would be alive, and the student who I had gave my opinion to, if he would be no longer alive, someone who's alive can contradict one who is no longer alive. But now, I and him are both alive. How could one person that's alive, that's a chai, contradict and challenge the one that is a chai? I'm stuck. Ram Gamliel resumed, continued to darshan, to give his shir, and all this time Rabbi Shua Raglav was standing on his feet, and he was being shamed. The crowd started murmuring, they didn't like what they were seeing, the anguish that was being caused to Rabbi Shua. They instructed the chutzpah, who was the interpreter, who would announce, who would call out the words of Ram Gamliel. They had no loudspeaker, so he was the loudspeaker. They told him, stop. Amoit, stop speaking. Va'amad, and he stopped, and he was silenced. And the crowd said as follows: Amri, at kama, until what point it's Ari v'nezel? Until what point will we cause Rabbi Shua anguish? Rosh Hashanah ishtakad, last year Rosh Hashanah tzari, Rabbi Gamliel caused Rabbi Shua tzar, anguish. B'v'chayres, in the sugya of b'chayres, in Masechta B'chayres with Meiser Ritzadik, with the story of Ritzadik tzari caused him anguish. There were different stories in the Gemara that Rabbi Gamliel caused tzar to Rabbi Shua. Hachanami tzari, here too he's causing him excessive anguish. Tov and Avri, let's remove Rabbi Gamliel from his post. Says man nukim. So who will we establish as a nasi in this place? Man nukim le. Nukle Rabbi Shua, are we going to establish Rabbi Shua? We'll appoint him as nasi. Bal Maisu, he was the one that was involved in this dispute with Rabbi Gamliel. It's too personal. It will cause Rabbi Gamliel too much anguish if he's being replaced by Rabbi Shua. Nukle Rabbi Akiva, will we appoint Rabbi Akiva? Dilma Anishle, perhaps Rabbi Gamliel will cause him to be punished. The less since Rabbi Akiva was a son of converts, he doesn't have the merit of righteous ancestors, and we don't want to take any chances since he might suffer on account of causing Rabbi Gamliel anguish. Ella, rather, Nukim Rabbi Lezer Azariah, let's appoint Rabbi Lezer Azariah, because he has all the qualities required to Chacham, he's wise, Asher, he's wealthy, Asir Ezra, 10th generation of Ezra, so he has all the miles. Asir Ezra, Chacham, he needs to be wise, the Machshlim Mefarakli. If he'll be challenged with a question, he'll know what to say. Vu'ashi is wealthy, the Yisle, the Fluchel, the Kesar, if he needs to serve the Kesar, needs to bring a gift or to influence the Kesar. Afu Azal Palach will be able to have influence in the government. Vu'asir le'Ezra, he is the 10th generation to Ezra, this is Chusavais, he has a schus of ancestors. For Leimatzi Anishle, and Ramliel will not be able to punish him. So they went and they offered the position to Rabbi Lezer. Also, are you okay with this position, to be the head of the yeshiva? He says, I'll go seek the advice of my wife. He went to ask his wife for advice. She told him, I'm not so keen on this. Maybe one day they'll go and remove you, just like they did to Rabbi Gamliel. Why get yourself involved in this situation? He says, no, lishtamish in Hashem echada because of the mukra. There's a saying that goes as follows: one should use an expensive cup, lishtamish in use just for one day, because of the murk, an expensive glass cup, even if tomorrow it breaks, meaning, let me seize the opportunity, even if it's only for a short while. Amr lay, but she told him, less so you have no white hair, you don't look distinguished enough. Says the Gemara, he was merely 18 years old, and he had no white hair. A miracle occurred. He received 18 rows of chivas of white hair. Some say it was in his beard, and now he looked distinguished enough to become a nasi. Hainu to come Rabbi Lezer. This is what Rabbi Lezer says. I'm like a 70-year-old man. I look distinguished like a 70-year-old man. But he wasn't really 70 years old. He was merely 18 years old, but he looked distinguished on account of his white hair.